Franchises have become increasingly popular in modern cinema. Expanding beyond just sequels, they now are inclusive to prequels, spin offs, television shows, and supplemental material like comic books, novels, and video games. These projects are no longer just connected by title but also continuity. This practice has a certain appeal to audiences as it further explores the worlds and characters beyond just the initial project. One of the best examples of this practice being exploited to its fullest potential is the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The MCU's structure of their copious projects is often cited as the blueprint for a cinematic universe. Many other studios have tried to produce their own cinematic universe, with little to no success. This can come from a lack of commitment, confidence, planning, or interest from either the audience or the studio. Though one studio has been able to find spikes of success with their own approach, Warner Brothers with their DC Extended Universe. A cinematic universe is not unique to comic book films, but it can feel like an appropriate genre for the practice because of how it mirrors the vast and connected worlds found within the source material. This is one of the main attractions for the audience, a chance to see these universes adapted to film, bringing along with it a different experience. In this video, I will be going over the history and development of the MCU DCEU and their debut projects and the legacy they left on their respective franchises, to see what makes for a strong foundation for a franchise.
God, look up there.
What the hell's that?
Easy, miss. I've got you.
You've got me? Who's got you?
In the early age of comic book movies, DC had a major advantage over Marvel. Both had their own respective presence in television, but Warner Brothers' ownership of DC allowed for their film projects to have direct access to a movie studio, allowing for their projects to have a greater chance of being produced. DC found early success by cashing in on their two biggest properties with Christopher Reeve's Superman and Burton and Schumacher's Batman movies. Conflict between the studio and the creative teams did cause for both franchises to deteriorate with each installment and eventually burn out. Their initial success, however, did show that there was value to be found in capitalizing on the popularity of their comic book characters. Other DC film projects outside of their big two were either not as successful or never even produced, showing that the studio had little faith in bringing their lesser-known characters to film, believing that the fault lied in the name and not the quality of the project. The majority of DC's film projects take place within their own continuity, with the main character as the sole superhero or supernatural figure. Warner Bros. Were more interested in these solo projects that had the potential of expanding, but so very few ever got that chance. There were a few never-made projects where DC properties would cross over or feature either appearances or references to the greater DC universe. It's a small complaint, but DC properties don't often practice this, with only some minor exceptions like Green Arrow Supermax, an unmade Green Arrow film project that would have had the title character in a Supermax prison with appearances from Lex Luthor and the Riddler, referencing the presence of their respective adversaries. Despite keeping their solo projects relatively contained, there was examples of development of prototype DCEUs among the decades and various projects. Michelle Pfeiffer's Catwoman was meant to get a spin-off after Tim Burton's Batman Returns. This project would gradually develop away from Burton's continuity and evolve into Halle Berry's Catwoman, a film guilty of wasting the potential of Halle Berry as Catwoman. This was not the only possible expansion of the Burtonverse. In the late 90s, Kevin Smith wrote a script for what would be titled Superman Lives, a project following the death and rebirth of Superman. The concept was originally developed to be a sequel to Christopher Reeve's Superman 4: A Quest for Peace. It would now supposedly take place in its own continuity. Smith's script included several references to and appearances of the greater DC universe, including Thanagar, Deadshot, and more significantly Batman and Gotham. When development began, Smith was pushed out as writer and replaced with Wesley Strick, who rewrote the script but still included the cameo appearance from Batman. By this time, Tim Burton was on to direct the project, with Nicolas Cage starring as the title character. Burton had been denied the ability to continue his Batman franchise with Michael Keaton, but this seemed like an opportunity to at least continue in the continuity. Unfortunately, we never got to see Nicolas Cage as Tim Burton's Man of Steel, or the cinematic continuation of his continuity, but the late 90s did see a form of crossover between the Man of Steel and the Dark Knight.
This is why Superman works alone.
DC's first real attempt at a cinematic universe spread across multiple titles came in the mid to late 2000s with George Miller's Justice League Mortal. The script was developed by the husband and wife writing team, the Maronis. The story featured the inclusion of many of DC's prominent characters and settings, influenced by many acclaimed comic book storylines. Miller and the studio had the initial idea for this film to be a foundation to several spin-offs featuring the main cast, exploring the world and characters that were introduced in Justice League Mortal. The production was met with conflicts and struggles, like the film was halted because of the writer's strike, and Miller and the studio argued over where the film should be shot. This made the studio begin to lose interest over time. Christopher Nolan, who had just released the successful Batman Begins and was beginning to develop his trilogy of films, felt very strongly that the studio should refrain from producing other projects that featured Batman in order to not confuse the audience or lose interest in his own projects. Even though this meant that DC would again be ahead of Marvel, Justice League Mortal was cancelled, including any kinds of development for other projects within the continuity. Warner Brothers would now return to focusing on solo projects and finishing Nolan's trilogy. Warner Brothers, however, would return to the idea of a shared series of films when developing Martin Campbell's Green Lantern. The MCU was already on its acceleration, and Warner Brothers felt like they needed to catch up. But the response to the film destroyed any confidence in continuing in that world as well. Warner Bros. Demanded their projects to aspire to the critical and financial success of their more profitable properties, but would not offer enough creative confidence in these newer projects, often resulting in the creative teams to conflict with the studios and producing mangled movies that had extreme potential. Marvel had the branch Marvel Films to oversee the licensing of the rights to their properties out to studios. This limited the possibility of Marvel getting their film projects produced. Marvel didn't find much success with their early attempts in cinema. Before their boom in the late 90s, early 2000s, their film projects were nowhere near as prestigious as DC's. While DC was already moving into cinema, Marvel was still involved in television, a medium both DC and Marvel continued to strive and experiment in. The mid and late 80s had Universal Studios produce two made-for-TV movies within the continuity of Bill Bixby's The Incredible Hulk series. The Return of the Incredible Hulk and The Trial of the Incredible Hulk were two of the earliest attempts at formulating and expanding comic book universe in live action. Both made-for-TV movies were meant to be backdoor pilots for the featuring characters, Thor and Daredevil. Neither project made it past their initial debut, but their method would be continued decades later. Marvel Studios lacked their own production studio, so the only way they could translate their characters and properties onto screen was to license them out to studios like Universal, New Line, Fox, and Sony. Many of the rights to their more recognizable characters were licensed out in the early 90s in response to the company's bankruptcy. It was at this time that many of the seeds to future projects were planted. Projects like the films that gave Marvel a presence in cinema at a time where DC was suffering another burnout. Despite some flops, the practice of licensing out their properties to different studios served as a momentary success for the company and the various studios. But the separation of properties that are otherwise tethered and connected to one another in the comics did feel like there was missed potential. Due to studios being protective of their properties, they kept a strict barrier between one another, connected only by the name Marvel. One of the earliest examples of this separation was with 1998's Blade. One of the alternate endings to this film featured a vague cameo from Michael Morbius. This ending wasn't used, and the sequel director Guillermo del Toro did decide to develop his own plans for the subsequent film, but New Line would not even be able to feature Morbius because he was owned by Sony. This minor limitation of not being able to tell a story featuring the Daywalker and the Living Vampire does go into a bigger issue. The fact that Mark Steven Johnson's Daredevil doesn't exist in Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy doesn't harm either franchise. But there should be creative freedom for artists to be able to draw from the entirety of the comics, which span decades, in order to tell the story that best represents the source material. The corporate division of these properties just limits the potential to tell stories that can fully capture the creativity found within the comics. The restriction of creative inclusion did bring an era of Marvel movies that were able to thrive within their own worlds. Beyond the studio's greed for profit, these projects were driven by story and characters, orchestrated by passionate creative teams. They expanded their worlds with characters and properties they had access to. This got even more common in the post-MCU era. Before being bought by Disney, Fox had amassed their own substantial universe, although it did suffer from weak continuity and quality. Sony remained persistent in their attempts to profit from their collected Marvel properties. At first, the expansion of their franchises remained under one title until expanding into multiple titles. Despite their own experimentation and restrictiveness of greater collaboration, they failed to reach the same heights as their other Marvel franchises. Both early Marvel and DC were limited in the exploration of their universes, leaving an opportunity for either franchise to fulfill this wanting desire from the audience of seeing their universe completely explored on film.
Wait! I am completely in the wrong movie. I am so sorry.
Truth is, I am Iron Man.
The practice of being resourceful with Marvel properties was even adopted by Marvel itself. Marvel began to grow tired of the lack of control they had on their film projects and having to share the profit with the studio. As Marvel movies were hitting their peak, Marvel Studios announced they would be developing their own independently planned projects. Many of the head people at Marvel Studios had a history with the previous films and with general Marvel entertainment like the 90s cartoons that featured a connected continuity. A person who qualified with this experience was president of Marvel Studios at the time, Avi Arad. In the mid-2000s, Arad announced that Marvel Studios would be developing a series of connected titles in the same continuity. He presented the initial 10 films for their first draft of the MCU. Showcasing their resourcefulness, Marvel Studios was pulling from the properties that they still held the rights to. This included lesser-known characters compared to properties like the X-Men, Fantastic Four, and Spider-Man. Little was actually developed for this early draft. What was known is that Doctor Strange was going to be a connective figure between titles, and that the Avengers film would have followed the same MCU format and be a collection of the previous solo titles. This slate was abandoned once the film rights to Iron Man returned to Marvel, and when Universal and Marvel reached an agreement over the rights to the Hulk. The new plan was to develop Iron Man as the debut film for the franchise with Jon Favreau on as director. As Iron Man began development, Avi Arad stepped down as president. This allowed for experienced comic book producer Kevin Feige to assume the leadership position. They were limited in resources but determined. This same perseverance was shown during the production of Iron Man. Favreau and the creative team had envisioned the film to be a grounded exploration of the character. The story was very driven by Tony Stark and his journey as he changes and grows. This is why Favreau believed Robert Downey Jr. was the perfect casting for the character, believing he was able to bring out the relatable human aspects of the character. Favreau thought that he would shepherd an Iron Man trilogy within Marvel's loosely planned universe. He had developed the first film with plans of continuing a multi-film arc. He had the initial sense that this franchise's projects would not be too reliant on or too interfering with one another. Over the course of development, however, Favreau had to drop this idea and instead just focus on the story at hand. They had developed Iron Man with a groundedness and believability that they thought would better appeal to modern audiences. It had been proven successful within the comics and with Christopher Nolan's 26th Batman Begins. This groundedness did have Favreau worried for future prospects within the franchise. He wanted to bring the world of the Marvel Universe onto the screen, but restricted himself to the realm of possibility. He believed it was smart and beneficial to have Iron Man be based solely in the realm of technology, because that would have been a good foundation for the franchise, since the Hulk and Captain America were based in some type of technology as well. We were worried about the inclusion of some of the more mystical, fantastical elements of the Marvel Universe. Earlier drafts of the script included the Iron Man villain, the Mandarin. The Mandarin is a controversial character, but the main reason Favreau decided to exclude him is not due to his cultural origins, but rather due to his comic book abilities. The Mandarin's source of power comes from a collection of 10 rings that are either advanced alien science or ancient magic. Favreau was fearful of introducing too much too soon. He didn't want the movie to be weighed down by massive world building. Favreau would continue to focus on the character, or at least the main character of Tony Stark. Development of Iron Man continued, excluding any major reveals of things like aliens or magic. Marvel Studios and the creative team lacked a solid plan of development for their franchise. They had one main objective, connecting their properties together for a culminated film. This allowed for Favreau and the rest of the cast and crew to work without a script. Only the action sequences featuring CGI and practical effects were written and planned, but the studio began to trust Favreau with things like dialogue, where he and the actors improvised. This made the actors feel more connected with their characters. The film's plot is rather self contained with almost no references to the greater Marvel Universe. There was one main presence that would be the connective tissue to the first phase of the MCU, Agent Phil Coulson of S.H.I.E.L.D. Similar to the Ultimates comics by Mark Miller and Brian Hitch, S.H.I.E.L.D. would be a main presence in the assembling of the Marvels. The MCU's first mid-credit scene where Samuel L. Jackson's Nick Fury meets with Robert Downey Jr.'s Tony Stark was actually a spontaneous addition to the film. Favreau and Feige were very particular about Fury's dialogue. They needed to relate to the audience the promise that there is more to come, that there is a larger universe that they will explore. But the thing is that Marvel wasn't even certain what this universe would look like. Despite the promise of a connected cinematic universe, Marvel's first priority was to prove that they can develop and produce their own quality films for their own properties. It was a gamble to bet that a B-list character like Iron Man would meet the praise familiar to Spider-Man, Batman, and Superman, but with passion and perseverance, they managed to do just that. The surprising financial and critical success that they found with Iron Man allowed Marvel Studios enough confidence to continue with their connected universe.
I am Iron Man. You think you're the only superhero in the world? Mr. Stark, you become part of a bigger universe. You just don't know it yet. Who the hell are you? Nick Fury, director of S.H.I.E.L.D.
Oh.
I'm here to talk to you about the Avenger Initiative.
Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins not only showed the audience a different approach to comic book movies, but also showed Warner Brothers. The rise of Nolan's Batman series showed Warner Brothers that there was potential for future profit with Nolan's interpretation of the DC universe. Around the time of the release of The Dark Knight, Nolan's writing partner on his Batman films, David S. Goyer, developed a modern take on Superman. Nolan was intrigued by this new idea as he helped Goyer pitch this more outwardly introspective interpretation of the character. As I mentioned, Warner Brothers have been struggling with developing a Superman project that they found successful, so they, Nolan, and Goyer began development on this Superman project. In the late 2000s, they chose Zack Snyder to direct, and he began to join the development. Familiar with the studio and a comic book fan, and familiar with the concept of a godly, powerful being in the real world. With the failure of Green Lantern and the rising success of the MCU, Warner Brothers still desired to develop their own connected series of films to capitalize on the concept. This venture did come into conflict with Nolan's approach to film. Nolan has his own way of developing movies that carried over to how he approached comic book films. He believed that the story and characters should be self-contained. This made him very protective of the continuity of his Dark Knight trilogy. He carried this belief with him through the development of Man of Steel. In early development, there was discussion of including this Superman project in Nolan's Dark Knight continuity, but he would continue to fight against this idea in order to keep the purity of his vision. Nolan suggested that this Superman project should be similar to his approach to his Batman films and limited to just the world of Superman, his traditional cast and settings and story restricted to its own contained continuity. But Warner Brothers neglected that direction and kept the DC EU idea on the table. The development still continued to take massive influence from Nolan's grounded, realistic approach to the DC universe. The film, the world, and character feel intentionally isolated, matching the tone of the Dark Knight trilogy. and being a major driving theme to the character. The attempted fusing of these two methods would come into conflict later on in the DCEU development, but it did allow for Snyder's Man of Steel to focus on Superman as a character and the world around him. The minimal development of the DCEU that took place during the Man of Steel's development was far looser than the development of the MCU with Iron Man. The inclusion of and references to other DC properties were as abundant and subtle as previous comic book films. There wasn't too much forced into the film, allowing it the opportunity to focus and build the character and world. And Snyder took full advantage of building the world of Krypton while being allowed to keep Earth relatively grounded and familiar. With the character of Superman, you're immediately allowed to do more with the audience acceptance of disbelief. You've already shown that this universe has other species that exist among the stars. You can often feel limited to Krypton with the limitation of references, but there's potential for future stories to include properties like the Fourth World and Martians. The critical response to Man of Steel was very mixed among audiences. Fans had little interest in Snyder and Goyer's Superman. They made certain decisions with the character and the story that didn't give the audience much confidence in the future exploration of the character. Warner Bros. Would ignore those complaints and continue with Snyder as the centered creative voice behind their DCEU. Snyder and Warner Bros.' intent with the DCEU, besides to profit, was to offer another interpretation of comic book films by continuing the example that Nolan established. Snyder wanted to creatively explore and express the DC universe in his own style, establishing a tone not based on the development of the universe, but rather the style of a director. This creative freedom would come more into conflict as the development of the DCEU continued.
Lane, I want you to meet our new stringer. I want you to show him the ropes. This is Clark Kent. Good luck, kid.
Hey, Steve.
Nice to meet you.
too.
Hi. Lois Lane. Welcome to the planet.
Glad to be here, Lois.
She with you?
I thought she was with you.
The major expansion of the DCEU came after the release of Man of Steel. After the release, Warner Bros. Announced the sequel with Snyder returning to direct, with Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, a film that was promised to introduce Batman and Lex Luthor and other DC properties like the term metahumans, being largely inspired by Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns. With Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice came retconning into this previously grounded continuity some major characters and events. In Man of Steel, Snyder's portrayal of Earth and humanity was meant to be realistic. His intent was to have Superman in the real world, similar to Nolan, but his sequel featured much more of his own interpretation of the real world and reality, far more exaggerated compared to the one featured in the previous film. It was evident that the studio gave him more creative freedom in the portrayal and expansion of the DCEU. At least they did when they released the ultimate cut of the film that actually featured more coherent world building, but that doesn't save the movie from feeling like a drag. This division between the studio wanting a more clear and focused product and Snyder wanting to portray his own vision would continue. During the development of Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, they had already begun to develop the idea of a Justice League project within the continuity, featuring the already casted actors and directed by Snyder. Again, insisting that Snyder was going to be the main force behind this new universe. At first, Snyder planned for a 5-film arc of a continuing storyline: Man of Steel, Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, and a 3-part Justice League project. There was still development of spin-off projects post-Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice that were produced. It was apparent that Warner Bros. Was trying to catch up with the MCU with the abundance of projects in their continuity. The development of the DCEU caused some conflict between DC's entertainment team and Warner Bros. Warner Bros. And DC had already had a long history of the studio disregarding notes from their DC consultants, and that relationship would continue. A common figure in this conflict is Jeff Johns. He had reportedly disliked Snyder's interpretation of Superman in Man of Steel and was hesitant to support his vision for the DCEU. When Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice released, it did not meet the standards that Warner Bros. Had set for it. The critical response was mainly negative, and the profit was not what Warner Bros. Desired. This failure made Warner Bros. Lose confidence in Snyder as their creative shepherd. This had a domino effect on the DCEU projects that were in development and production. Abandoned was their intent to be a creative rival to the MCU, now submitting to their rival's approach to comic book movies and a connected universe. Warner Bros. Now turned to DC's consultants to try and change the tone of the universe, which is what they blamed for the failure of Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice. David Ayer's Suicide Squad was extremely altered by the studio in reshoots and post-production. Snyder had already begun production on his intended first part of his Justice League project. He began to experience massive creative interference from the studio and DC's consultants. What is considered to be the sliver of light in this hectic period was Patty Jenkins' Wonder Woman. The film felt like a breath of fresh air at the time for its more outwardly hopeful tone. The film still experienced studio interference. The entire final fight was apparently added on at the end by the studio, harming the film to some critics. This film also was the first to have more influence from the DC creative team. Warner Bros. Promised to continue to try and now copy Wonder Woman's success. Despite Snyder's role in the development of Wonder Woman, Warner Bros. Was starting to move away from his vision. The production of Justice League was full of controversies. The creative suppression of Snyder by the studio and consultants kept on throughout the production. This excessive interference and opposition to Snyder's vision did not stop even when he suffered a major tragedy with the loss of his daughter. He claims the studio continued to argue with him after the tragedy, up to the point he could no longer continue on the project. Warner Bros. Took this as an opportunity to remold the project and set it in a direction they now preferred. This was held by producers John Berg and Johns, and by bringing in Joss Whedon to substitute as director. Whedon and Johns' influence over the film and presence on set has been intensely criticized. Their final product was the theatrical release of Justice League in 2017. The responses were mixed at first until eventually becoming solely negative. Warner Bros. Continued in the DCEU, now departed from Snyder's vision. They produced 2 relatively successful films. Both were aligned with the tone of Wonder Woman and the MCU. This has given way to the DCEU featuring lesser-known characters and properties, showing Warner Bros. That they do have the potential to be admired and profitable. The DCEU began to experiment with their projects. They loosened their connectivity. They were now just telling stories that simply existed within the same continuity. with references and cameos being a constant reminder, no longer gradually moving towards an event or continuing a multi-film storyline. The massive success of Todd Phillips' Joker saw Warner Brothers again going in a different direction with their DC projects. For a brief period, the DC consultants had a power over the direction of the DCEU, but that power was quickly taken away from them and reverted back to the studio, especially after the success of Joker. The studio will now produce projects with no connection to the DCEU at all, existing within their own continuity. Ben Affleck's The Batman developed into one of these solo projects and became Matt Reeves' The Batman, another successful reason for Warner Brothers to continue on this path. President of Warner Brothers, Walter Hamada, developed this strategy in order to profit off of the popularity and the fans' familiarity with the multiverse. This new approach has allowed for Warner Brothers to try and convert more of their audience into HBO Max subscribers. The increase of streaming services has even allowed Warner Brothers to again copy Marvel with developing shows for these streaming services, furthering expanding the universe. This even included Warner Brothers allowing Zack Snyder to finish his cut of the Justice League and releasing it on the streaming service. It doesn't amend how the studio treated him, but he has been able to show the audience a vision that is closer to the one he had intended. It has also fueled the demand for the continuation of Snyder's vision for the DCEU. The DCEU continues to struggle as the regime constantly changes at Warner Brothers. This brings along different executives' vision for the DCEU, but none lasts long enough to execute a formulated plan. Instead, they have seemingly reverted back to producing safe projects that they have more of a guarantee on, which are more of the solo projects, no longer promising an intriguing way of approaching comic book films within their franchise of connected titles.
Well, I'll be in touch. Oh, and some have called me the Martian Manhunter. Guess I'll see you around.
Despite the creative team being able to overcome the struggle they faced on Iron Man, they continued to face conflict with the development and production of their follow-up projects. Iron Man was to be immediately followed up by the release of Louis Leterrier's The Incredible Hulk. The production of the film saw creative conflict between the creative team, Marvel, and Universal. It was thought that this title would be a safe rebound, seeing that the Hulk is a more popular character, but all of that conflict resulted in the project suffering and not being as critically successful as its predecessor. It did manage to retain a tone that was consistent to the previous film. It was evident that the universe was moving forward with the introduction of all these characters and properties. A cameo appearance by Robert Downey Jr. hinted that the newly outed hero is helping Fury assemble the Avengers. This would bring the first retcon of the MCU. Closer to the release of the potential ensemble film, they released their first short that would give a different meaning to this mid-credits scene. Now, with new and more concrete plans, they were able to mend some of the cracks from their previous days where they lacked clearer direction. Conflicts between the studio and the creative teams have continued throughout the entirety of the MCU. The studio has established some creative limitations that they claim maintain order in a franchise that consists of dozens of projects. it has resulted in some projects feeling generated rather than developed, worsening over time as the quantity rises while the quality drops. In the early days, the MCU had the Creative Committee, a group of artists, producers, and writers who were familiar with Marvel properties. They were creative consultants who carried a significant amount of weight across the development and production of the films. This proved to be more of a hindrance rather than a benefit, as it caused creative conflict, it affected production, and it interfered with the vision of some projects. Another barrier that Feige had to overcome in order to bring out more creative freedom was in the form of Ike Perlmutter, the CEO of Marvel, who had been connected with the company since the 90s during its bankruptcy. He had very old-fashioned views of entertainment and the world that greatly restricted the potential of the MCU. Given Feige eventually went over the creative committee and Perlmutter to complain to Bob Iger about the interference, Iger decided to disband the committee, and Feige would now only report straight to his advisors at Disney. This new era of the MCU did spawn projects that allowed for the creative team to explore with their own visions. This freedom has been made relative and remains managed but by a less dictative creative body. The first significant expansion of the MCU came in Iron Man 2 with the presence of Samuel L. Jackson's Nick Fury and Scarlett Johansson's Black Widow that were significant to the story. Around that time, the studio had officially announced the fixed dates for their future releases, so they needed to amplify the progress towards assembling the Avengers. The movie is weighed down by setting up the Avengers in an unsatisfying manner. You can feel the lack of solid planning. It would have been fine if that world building didn't feel so poorly incorporated into the main story, which was already lacking. Again, the studio's interference and greedful desire to continue capitalizing on Iron Man harmed the outcome of their project, not giving enough time to fully develop the project and its effect on the future of their universe. Jon Favreau's worry towards the introduction of the classic mystical elements of the Marvel Universe was eventually confronted by Marvel Studios with 2011's Thor. They decided to hire Kenneth Branagh due to his history with theater and Shakespeare, a history that can be felt within the film. Branagh's portrayal of Asgard and her people allowed for there to be a familiarity that the audience felt. The introduction of magic and space is more hinted at and not truly explored too much in the film, allowing for a competent, character-driven story to be told while expanding the universe as the story goes on. By the time Captain America: The First Avenger and The Avengers were released, audiences were familiar enough with the universe they've been presented with, allowing for the studio to get more confident and comfortable. The mid-credit scene featured in The Avengers was another one of their additional scenes that made promises they would have to find creative ways to fulfill. They challenged themselves with this practice, but it became so prominent that it eventually felt like they were always moving forward, continuously moving towards the next event or storyline, without allowing their universe to set and settle and rest for a moment. The progression of the franchise was steady and regularly enjoyable, but some projects were affected by this need to consistently be setting up plot points and introducing and including characters that can feel forced for future installments. More and more projects began to experience the same issues as Iron Man 2, the universe being put in front of the story, coming off as generated filler projects that lacked the creative passion to tell an interesting story with compelling characters. Iron Man was a solid story with solid characters that had its faults, but it managed to establish a world that could be gradually developed. The rush of Iron Man 2 set a new pace that has been too present in the MCU. The current state of the MCU is varying in quality. The studio still has a sense of creative restrictions that produce average projects that often leave audiences unsatisfied. There is direction and development and planning of the MCU, but the fixation on mass appeal and excessive connectivity can be draining and limiting rather than explorative. Both franchises have had their successful outings and both have faced their criticisms. They have their flaws that have been there since their debut and some they've added over time. They have found success during their own exploration of their respective universes and experimentation with the format. People often claim that the MCU is the best because of their direction and planning. It has gotten stronger over the years, but it's important to remember that in the beginning their main goal was to put the story and characters first, then the franchise. It allowed for the assembling of these characters to feel fulfilling because you got to know and understand who they are and how they've changed. Man of Steel tripped over itself with the rather different directions for the DCEU. Warner Brothers seemed to want Nolan's Superman, but they hired Snyder for his vision of the DC universe, so that's what he gave them until they lost that desire. Lack of confidence in an artist and a project can make for a faulty foundation. But even with that foundation, there has been creative teams that have managed to produce aspiring projects still within the DCEU that might continue the universe despite not much effort put in from the studio. It's fine if a project can simply exist within the continuity of a franchise. It's fine if a project's main goal is the further expansion of the franchise. The important thing to maintain through both types is that there must be an actually interesting story that continues the character's journey, or else it can feel like a waste of potential. Confidence in the future, though, is what needs to be kept when developing these franchises. They should have an idea of what kind of tone they want to have for the universe, but they should refrain from using one sole creative voice in establishing that tone. These franchises have been expanded on much better through the collaboration of creativity, complementing the films that they were built upon. Both franchises were built on a foundation of resourcefulness, intriguing ideas, and the desire to establish a universe of potential.